Good afternoon, Luke. I'm David Papineau. I'm professor of philosophy. My full time, I'm professor of philosophy of natural science at King's College London. Uh, and I'm very glad to be here this afternoon.
Right, yeah, thanks for being here. It's really great. I don't know, it's kind of like an honor to have you here.
Thank you.
So do you have any like new books coming out or anything or
I I had a book came out, what now, 4 years ago, on perception, the metaphysics of sensory experience. Arguing against various views about sensory experience and consciousness and representation. But that's what I'm working on at the moment. I'm working on something that's completely outside the philosophy of mind. I've got a book on causation, which is nearly finished. A big fat book, something I've been working on in a way for decades, and that should be done end of the summer. So I'm feeling pretty good about that, but it's occupying most of my time at the moment.
you have a title for it or still kind of working on it?
It's an interesting issue. So, okay, I'll tell you what it's about
Hmm.
or what motivates it. There's this business that goes on outside philosophy, outside academia, which you can call causal inference. People infer causal conclusions, causal structures from correlational data. It's something that social scientists and epidemiologists and marketing people have been doing for nearly 100 years. And philosophy doesn't say very much about it. And in particular, none of the standard theories of causation really explain why these inference techniques work. And so that's what I want to do. I want to develop a metaphysical account of causation, account of the nature of causation that will explain how causal inference works. And then when I've done that, I will explain the connection of causation to rational action and single case causes and counterfactuals and so on. So, well, you can advise me. I kind of had the idea I was just going to call it causes because this is in my mind, it's going to change the whole landscape. I'm basically closing down the causation business. This is going to be the last word, causes, right? This is it. It's done. But the publisher and the readers who had to look at the proposal and draft of a few chapters said, no, that makes it sound like a textbook. And no, you shouldn't call it causes or causation. You've got to give it a more specific title. And so I said, all right, I can see the point. It's not a textbook. And the publisher then, we were thinking the metaphysics or causation, but that's a bit of a mouthful. And my last book was the metaphysics of sensory experience. So she suggested, the editor, senior editor at Cambridge University Press, that we call it the nature of causation, and that's the working title at the moment. But the more I think about it, that's kind of it's a bit boring sounding, isn't it? The nature of causation. So I want to go back to causes, maybe causes colon subtitle metaphysics for causal inference. So I still like causes and maybe a subtitle. So what do you think? The nature of causation or causes and metaphysics for causal inference?
So I guess personally I like the nature of causation. That just sort of sounds nicer to me, but
Uh,
um
okay,
I don't know.
and I'll take a poll. I mean, I can take a poll on Facebook, and but the more I think about it, I'm still going back to my original idea. But I'm not always good at titles, so
Yeah,
I'm happy.
there's there's kind of it's hard in philosophy, right? Because what you're doing is like I mean, it's to most people, right? I think it's a little bit sort of drab, right? I mean, I don't know if you ask like my mom, right? Like, do you prefer causes or do you prefer the nature of causation? She's not going to care, right? So then it's like you can kind of have fun with it a little bit. Like, there's an article, right, about sort of evolutionary debunking arguments, and it's called Debunking Debunkers Debunkers, right? And it's like that's a fun title, but it's really hard to figure out how to do that with a lot of philosophy stuff, you know?
Yeah, but maybe it doesn't matter so much for books, but for articles, certainly it. So advice to young philosophers, really think quite hard about the title of your article. It makes a huge difference to who's going to read it and does it get any recognition and so on. And I've got some terrific articles that scarcely ever get read, have half a dozen citations because I had the wrong title. And so I'm going to think quite hard about this, about how to title this book.
Yeah. Well, whatever it turns out to be, I think I'm going to have to keep an eye on it. Certainly, it's an area that it overlaps with things I'm interested in, so I'll have to give that a read when it comes out. I guess for now, I was going to sort of drag you back to the stuff that I guess you thought was behind you, the Phil of Mind stuff, talk about consciousness a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, so the basic kind of picture that you've got, right, is a kind of identity theory, where we sort of just want to identify mental states with certain physical states, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's issues about multiple realization and non-reductive physicalism and so on. But I'm happy at this stage to say I'm an identity theorist. The mind is just the brain. There's nothing over and above the brain going on in the mental realm.
Sure.
Mhm.
Um, So there's a kind of like standard argument, I guess, not necessarily for identity theory specifically, but just for physicalism, right? And it's called you can run this kind of causal closure argument, and the idea is, wherever you look for a kind of physical effect that has a sort of sufficient um, physical cause.
Mhm.
And I guess I was sort of wondering, how do you frame that in like a I don't know, a way that has like teeth, right? Because if it's sort of an inductive sort of thing, right, like all the physical causes or all the physical sort of events that we know of have sufficient physical causes. I don't know. Maybe that's like it can provide a sort of presumption against theories that want to deny that. But if you're like a dualist, right, you're just going to say, I don't know. Maybe that holds usually, but if it's sort of an inductive argument, it's just not going to work. Like I'm just going to say that my theory is like an exception to it. I don't know. I guess I was just wondering if there's like a sort of non-problematic way to sort of push this point.
Yeah, it's a very interesting issue. And I think it helps to look at it historically. Now, let's I'm going to say more history in a minute, but just kind of my personal history. I got kind of interested in these issues in the 80s, late 80s, partly because I was working mostly in philosophy of science then. I was in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at Cambridge. And reduction was considered implausible then, generally reduction, I mean, in all kinds of areas, for kind of history of science reasons. So the idea of reduction was when you had one theory, I don't know, classical thermodynamics, and then a later theory came along, and it you could deduce the older theory from the new one, or classical mechanics and relativity. You could deduce classical mechanics from relativity, plus the assumption that nothing's moving terribly fast. And then people like Feyerabend and Kuhn said, no, no, that's not right, because if you look at the history of science, the new theories don't kind of uh, uh, vindicate the old theories of special cases. They refute them. They show they're all wrong, right? So reduction is all mistaken. And I started thinking, well, I'm not especially against that, but there's another kind of reduction I'm interested in, metaphysical reduction, which has nothing to do with the development of science over time. It's a kind of synchronic thing. It's to do with different levels of reality. How do they relate to each other? I mean, as people would now say, is chemistry grounded in physics? Is sociology grounded in psychology? And and when I thought about it, I thought, yeah, and I'm inclined to say that chemistry is grounded in physics, and what's more, psychology is grounded in physics. I'm inclined to say that the mental realm is grounded in uh, the brain. And but I had plenty of colleagues especially Hugh Miller, uh, who just didn't agree. They said, "Why do you think everything is grounded in physics?" So I started looking for an argument, and I mean, I wouldn't say it's especially original for me, and in fact, I've written about how it's implicit in a lot of earlier arguments due to Feigl and David Lewis and Jack Smart and David Armstrong and so on. I mean, 50s and 60s arguments for physicalism. But I kind of got interested in what's driving those arguments. And I said, look, the thing they're all assuming, even if they're not particularly explicit about it, is that all physical effects have physical causes. That if you, in particular, the physical effects you see in people's bodies and behavior, they have physical causes. If I raise my arm as I'm doing, why did that happen? Well, that happened because nerve messages came down my arm, muscles contracted. And why did the nerve messages come down my arm? Because certain activity in the motor cortex. And why did that happen? Certain activity in prefrontal cortex, and so on. And if you look at it from a scientific point of view, everybody expects that at each stage you can trace the causation back to prior physical causes. Nobody thinks that something comes down from outside, and no physiologists think in that kind of way. And so I said, that's the causal closure of the physical. And if you accept that, uh, you're going to have to be a physicalist. I mean, should I run through the arguments? The arguments normally put like this: that look, mental states like my feelings, my pains, my desires, they have physical effects. In particular, they have effects on my actions. Okay, that's assumption one. Assumption two is all physical effects uh, have physical causes. That's what I was just gesturing at. I mean, if you think about the physiology, you expect to be able to explain all these physical effects and physical causes. Premise three, you don't want to assume. It would be slightly crazy to suppose every time I move my arm, it's got two independent causes, the mental cause and a different physical cause. That looks like the wrong model. So how are you going to put together the fact that my arm moving has a mental cause and it also has a physical cause, but it doesn't have two causes? Well, there's only one way to square that circle, to say the mental cause and the physical cause are the same. So, and that's a pretty tight argument. One can quibble a bit, but the interesting thing is the thing that's doing all the work, as you alluded to, is the second premise, the causal closure premise. Every physical effect has a physical cause. And when I put the argument to my colleagues, people like Hugh Miller, they said, well, where do you get that premise from, the causal closure? I mean, that's been pulled out of thin air. And I said, no, no, hang on. I mean, I was brought up as my first degree was in maths and physics and so on. Of course, that's true. Everybody knows that all physical effects have physical causes. And I kind of went so far as to suggest that they were denying this only because they weren't sufficiently trained in physics. But in fact, Hugh Mellor, my colleague, was perfectly well trained in physics, and he said, "Come on, show me where it's written down in the physics books that every physical effect had a physical cause." And I started to look at it and think about it, and doesn't it follow from various conservation laws and so on? And the truth is no. Uh, if you look at the history of modern physics from Descartes onwards, I mean, it's a long story, and we can go into it if you want, but the truth is that the idea that every physical effect has a physical cause and doesn't have a sui generis mental cause is a very modern idea. I mean, just by way of support from that, when I was young, there were people who thought, serious scientific people, who thought that in the brain there was some kind of autonomous, sui generis mental action that made a difference to what we did, that somehow the conscious mind came down and fiddled around in the prefrontal cortex and So John Eccles, eminent neuroscientist, thought that. Karl Popper thought that. And I used to think, God, that's pretty cranky. Those guys are way out and the fringe. But the truth was they weren't cranky. They were just old. They'd grown up at a time when that was the standard assumption. And through the 18th, 19th, into the 20th century, most scientifically informed people assumed that there were sui generis independent mental causes. I mean, they thought that in addition to whatever were the fundamental physical forces, gravity, electromagnetism, maybe they had a few more chemical forces and so on, there were also mental forces. There was, I mean, you know the term mental energy, nervous energy. Somebody's full of nervous energy. It's a term from the 19th century, and it literally meant the potential energy of the nervous force field. They thought that in addition to gravity and so on, there was a nervous force field. And when you deliberated, you built up the potential energy in the nervous force field. And when the time for action came, you released it in the form of kinetic energy and your arm moved. So uh, the idea I'm appealing to as kind of obvious, the causal closure of the physical, wasn't obvious 150 years ago. But why is it obvious now? I mean, you're saying it's not obvious to you, and somebody who's inclined to classical interactive dualism should, of course, deny the causal closure of the physical. But I think many people find it difficult nowadays to deny that. I mean, by way of evidence for that claim, just a sociological claim, if you think about the philosophers who who feel that no, the mind can't be identical to the brain, the hard problem, consciousness is something extra. Scarcely any of them are interactive dualists. So Frank Jackson, when he first put forward his Mary argument for dualism, was an epiphenomenalist. Epiphenomenal qualia was the paper that came just before the Mary paper. And Dave Chalmers was half an epiphenomenalist, and now the dominant strand of anti-physicalism, dualism is panpsychism, which again is we can talk about it, but it's a position carefully designed to accommodate a conscious mind that's extra to the physical realm without violating causal closure. So scarcely any serious philosophers are inclined to say causal closure is wrong. Something comes down from outside the law-governed realm of science and makes an independent difference. Okay, so far I'm just giving you sociology, but I think what happened is through the 20th century, uh, more and more was discovered about the operation of the brain and operation of cellular mechanisms, and in particular, action potentials in neurons. And once, I mean, I don't think it's an accident that all the well-known arguments for physicalism in philosophy in the 50s and 60s are about the same time as Huxley and Hodgkin figured out the operation of neurons. And I think that was a kind of clincher, persuaded most people that everything going on in the brain could be explained in terms of chemistry, electromagnetism, no independent sui generis mental forces. So that's what the causal closure is, and that's why I think it's well supported. And yeah, okay, I'll stop there. You can come back now.
Yeah. So I guess something that I think it was Chalmers, right? That he's like aware of this, right? But he sort of doesn't buy it because he's like even if you map um, or maybe he accepts causal closure, right? But he's like he still thinks there's something extra, right? Because even if you map all the neuronal firings or whatever, something's still sort of missing, right? Is going to be the sort of idea here.
Okay,
Um,
let's go slowly. The point I was making through that long little ramble was that nobody really denies causal closure, not even Chalmers or Jackson.
Right.
On the other hand, they do have arguments that they think are compelling that the mind, the conscious mind, is something over and above the brain. They don't want to end up as epiphenomenalists, so they look around for another way of getting the story straight, a way of having the mind separate from the physical realm, uh, not denying causal closure, not having epiphenomenalism. Okay, where you? I mean, there's a question about where you're going to go, but uh, sorry, I interrupted you there, but I just wanted to say I don't think that you can say Chalmers denies causal closure. He denies the identity theory, so he thinks there's a way of uh, uh, avoiding physicalism while respecting causal closure, and we might talk about that. But when we look into it, this is the panpsychist option. I don't think you'll find that it really denies causal closure.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's right. I think sort of at first I misspoke and then I sort of corrected it. I think he doesn't deny it, and I think I guess I was just trying to ask, as far as his like, as far as the general sort of thing goes, right, where it's like, well, there still seems like there's something extra, and you want to go panpsychism, maybe. I mean, why don't you want to go that route?
Ah, uh, well, two reasons. Uh, let's get the dialectical situation laid out. So there's the causal closure argument, pushes fairly strongly for the mind is just the brain. You've got to push the mind down into the brain. Okay. Then there's a bunch of arguments. I mean, Dave Chalmers is the main proponent, following Frank Jackson, uh, which have the contrary conclusion: the mind can't just be the brain. So there's the Mary knowledge argument. There's the so-called conceivability argument, the zombie argument. These are all arguments that say the mind can't be the same as the brain. Now, I actually don't think those arguments are any good. I think those arguments have holes in them. So I have no reason to avoid just being a happy physicalist. Uh, so that's one reason I'm not a panpsychist. Uh, the other reason is that I think they're good independent arguments against panpsychism. That it doesn't really help with the problems, and so we could talk about that. Let's see where. Okay, but we better explain for our audience what panpsychism is. So it's this view. So the idea is that physics and science generally tells us about the laws that govern the world, about the patterns that we find in the world, the structure of the world. So, yeah, basic physics, force equals mass times acceleration, pressure equals proportional to volume, and so on, uh, inversely proportional to volume. Uh, so it tells you about the relation between mass and acceleration and force. But so the thought goes, it doesn't tell you what mass and force and so on are. It tells you about what the basic quantities do, but not what they are. So the idea is, and it's pretty standard in philosophy, and I was certainly brought up with this way of thinking, that there's certain properties, quantities, uh, having a certain mass, having a certain pressure, and so on. And then there's a bunch of laws that you can discover by doing empirical investigation. But the thought is that the identity of the properties themselves leave it open what the laws are. Uh, those same properties could have fitted into different laws, or you could have the same structure of laws, but they could be, as it were, instantiated by different properties. So the idea is we have the properties, these features that objects have, and then we have uh, laws stating the relationship between the different properties. And and the panpsychists start with the thought that, look, even after you find out the structure of the laws, you don't yet know what the properties filling them out are. Okay, now we get to the panpsychism. The thought is, look, in the actual world, we have the patterns that are shown to us by science, but we don't get from science the nature of the things, the nature of the properties and quantities that are related by these laws. Uh, People sometimes talk about quiddities, the property. Which property is it that plays the mass role in force equals mass times acceleration? And now the idea is, and this comes from Bertrand Russell, that there is one place where we have direct contact with the properties and quantities that enter into the laws. It's when we introspect our own minds. We're directly acquainted with the nature of the properties involved. And so when we introspect, we can kind of see the conscious properties that uh, sometimes it said breathe fire into the equations, give substance to the structure that science describes for us. And now the thought is, well, so science tells us all about the structure, but it doesn't tell us about the quiddities, the items that breathe fire into the equations. And what we discover in introspection is that those uh, uh, quiddities, those properties, the essence of those properties is conscious, and that's something extra to what we're told by science. And it's consistent with this line of thought that there might be another possible world that has the same structure of equations, but where the entities, the quiddities that uh, provide the substance of reality is not conscious. So the idea is consciousness is now something extra to what we're given by science. Uh, uh, a lot of the anti-physicalist arguments uh, are put as arguments for the possibility of zombies. There could be somebody physically just like me, imagine, make a physical duplicate, yet is not conscious. And that if you accept the possibility of a zombie, you're accepting that consciousness is something extra to the physical makeup. Because here's me, I'm conscious, all the physical stuff. Here's my zombie counterpart. Uh, it's it's got all the same physics as me, but is not conscious. So consciousness is something extra to the physics. The panpsychists can say, yes, yes, we think zombies are possible. We think there's something extra to the physics, not something like Descartes' separate mind coming down and making a difference to the physical laws. It's not something that contradicts the physical laws, but there's this extra fact about the way the physical laws are given substance by conscious properties in our world, but another possible world in which there's the same structure of physics, but there's no consciousness. The things that play the force role and the mass role and so on in that other world don't substantiate, don't ground consciousness. And so their idea of a zombie is not somebody who's going to start behaving differently because it's got some independent mind stuff making a difference. It's the idea of a being who behaves exactly the same as me. It's got all the same physics. We're not denying causal closure. Everything is going to, on the surface, seem the same, but inside, nobody's at home, as it were. The properties in that other world do not deliver consciousness. Now, I just find this whole metaphysics completely unmotivated. The whole idea that there's quiddities that are separate from the laws seems to me crazy. I mean, I was brought up to believe it, but I didn't really worry about it until people started making this use of the idea that the nature of the property is something separate to the laws. But once that idea is put on the table, it just seems wrong to me. The idea is another possible world just like this world, the physicists would have come along and seen that accelerations are proportional to forces, inversely proportional to masses. But in that other world, the quantity that resists acceleration is not our mass, but some other thing, smash. And I think, hang on, this is a world which is just like this world. It behaves every way the same way. Uh, the big bodies resist forces more than the small bodies. But you're telling me that it's different in that uh, underneath the behavior, the it's a different thing doing the resistance. I say that's crazy. That other world is just this world again, and this thing you're calling mass is just mass. So that's my basic disquiet about panpsychism. I don't see any reason to believe the underlying metaphysics of property and laws that it trades in. I mean, there's a lot of other internal problems about panpsychism, but that's my main worry about it. A, I don't buy the arguments for the possibility of zombies that makes people want to be panpsychists, and B, I don't really find the metaphysics of laws and properties that they invoke at all plausible. So that's why I don't want to be a panpsychist. I mean, I've got uh, objections from both sides, as it were. I think it's unmotivated, and I think it's based on a flawed metaphysics.
So about the zombies then, it sounds like maybe you want to, do you think they're sort of inconceivable or do you think they're just not possible?
No, I think they're perfectly conceivable. So this relates to, I mean, it might be helpful to go through the history of the arguments for and against physicalism. I alluded to, we haven't really gone into it. People like Jackson and Chalmers who think there are good philosophical arguments to show that the mind cannot be identical to the brain. Uh, right, dialectical situation, you've got the causal closure argument, uh, says the mind is identical to brain. And now people start thinking that seems pretty difficult to grasp, and maybe there's reasons for philosophical reasons for thinking it can't be right. So I can kind of, when I started doing philosophy, and I'm slightly embarrassed to say when that was, uh, we kind of really weren't supposed to talk about consciousness very much. It had become a no-no subject following Wittgenstein and Ryle and so on. And then there was Nagel's argument, what it's like to be a bat. And I'm just trying to remember the date, probably about 72, 73, saying, come on, you guys, there's something you're kind of closing your eyes to. There's this real puzzling thing, consciousness. How does consciousness get into the physical world? And he, I mean, he raised the issue, and implicit in that article, I mean, wonderful article. Uh, but exactly how it worked as an argument was a little bit obscure in the way Nagel wrote it. And you can think of Jackson's Mary argument as a pacification, a refinement of one strand in Nagel's paper. So then, just trying to remember the dates. I mean, it was probably took best part of a decade, but you have the Mary argument. So we all know the Mary argument. I take it, I'll just for anybody listening, watching, doesn't, there's Mary, she's a future brain scientist, she works on color vision. She's a whiz. She knows everything there is to know about color vision, color experience from a scientific point of view. So she knows all about the eye, the rods and cones, V1, the visual cortex, all the things the brain does. V4 is probably where the color vision goes on. She knows all about that, everything there is to know about it. Except she's never actually seen any colors herself. She's lived all her life in a black and white room. All her TV's black and white. Her books have got black and white illustrations and so on. And then one day she comes out and sees a red rose. And Jackson says, look, come on, surely she now learned something she didn't know before. And possibly that looks kind of plausible because later on she might go and see some green grass, right? And so she has one experience looking at a red rose, another experience looking at green grass. And if you think about it, it seems very plausible that before she came out, she didn't know it was going to be that way round. I mean, nothing in her scientific training, I mean, it's all book learning, tells her that the rose is going to be like this feeling and the grass is going to be like that feeling. It could easily have been the other way around for all she knew as a scientist. So it looks like she's learned something new. So premise one, she learned something new. Premise two, she knew everything there was to know about the physics of color vision. So if she knew all there is to know about the physics of color vision and she's learned something new, there must be something about color vision that's not physical. I mean, that's a nice argument. Okay. Okay, pretty quickly, people came back and said, that's too quick. There's a perfectly good physicalist, materialist explanation for what happened to Mary. We don't have to suppose that there's something in reality that's not physical. Rather, we can explain the change in Mary by saying she's acquired a new way of thinking about color experience. She's acquired a new way of thinking about the experience of seeing something red. The thought is she could always think about that experience using her scientific concepts, her scientific science, certain kind of oscillation in V4. I mean, a physicalist will say that's what red experience is, certain kind of neural oscillation in this area of the visual cortex. And Mary could always talk about and refer to that. Now she's got a new way of thinking about that same physical state. It's a way of thinking about it that she's acquired as a result of having had the experience. Now she's had the experience, she can recreate it in imagination. She can think of the experience in question as now she recreates in imagination. She thinks this kind of experience. But this new way of thinking about experience is just referring to the same thing that she always used to refer to as oscillations phi in V4. So, my friend and colleague Tim Crane says, two concepts, one thing. Philosophers love that. The evening star, Hesperus and Phosphorus, one referent. And the physicalists respond to the Mary argument in just the same way. They say Mary's acquired an extra concept that refers to the same thing as her old concept. She mightn't know they refer to the same thing, but they actually do. And there's just one thing in reality. And that's a perfectly good response to the Mary argument. Okay. And I mean, I'm just trying to remember, I think Terry Horgan made that response pretty fast soon after the Mary paper. Chris Peacock, I think, did it. And then Brian Law wrote a paper, which is considered the standard paper, introducing the idea of phenomenal concepts. So the idea is that Mary acquires a new phenomenal concept, the kind of concept you have for thinking about experiences as a result of having had the experiences themselves, but they don't refer to anything extra in reality. Look, here's an analogy. Suppose somebody knows that they're a social historian. They know there's this kid, Archie Leach, was born in Bristol in 1910 or whatever it was. Uh, uh, and then they're reading Movie Magazine and they learn that Cary Grant was born in Bristol. They mightn't know that Archie Leach and Cary Grant are the same person. So there's a sense in which they know something they didn't know before. They didn't know that Cary Grant was born in Bristol. I mean, I knew that Archie Leach was born in Bristol. So there's a sense of they've got some new knowledge, but it's only new at the level of concepts. They've kind of got two concepts for the same thing. And while they knew the first concept, born in Bristol gave you a truth, they didn't know the second concept, born in Bristol gave you a truth, but now they do know that. So they've got some new knowledge, but it doesn't mean they've discovered that there's some extra person that counting the people born in Bristol that they were one short before. It's like it's the same guy still under the new description. So just the same, right? To infer that Mary has discovered a new feature of reality is a mistake. She's just got a new concept for thinking an old feature of reality. Two issues. One, given it's so easy for physicalists to respond in this way, why did anybody think the Jackson argument was such a good argument? Why did Jackson think the Jackson argument was such a good argument? I mean, that's one interesting question. Second interesting question is if the physics can respond in this way, why do people keep on going on about the fact that there's good arguments for thinking the mind is different from the brain? If I'm not boring, I'll just say something quickly about both of those. I mean, the first question, why everybody thought it was a good argument, is because nobody had entertained the idea of these extra phenomenal concepts before. Prior to Jackson, everybody kind of agreed that all our ways of thinking about mental states were kind of scientifically available, certain kind of brain state, the kind of state, whatever it is that causes certain behavior, that was all thought that all our concepts of mental states were third personal concepts. That's the view that's still endorsed by one or two people. Daniel Dennett always held to that view. Curiously, Frank Jackson came round to it at the end of his life. I could talk about that if you wanted. So people all used to be what are now called type A physicalists. They thought it was kind of if you knew everything about the behavior and the physics of somebody, you automatically knew there wasn't any other way of thinking about their mental life. And so that and if you think about Wittgenstein's private language argument and some of Ryle's things, there were strong arguments around that you couldn't think about mental states in this kind of first personal, the state that I had for the first time that I came out the room. That people their minds were closed before Jackson to the possibility of such concepts of mental states. So Jackson forced us to introduce phenomenal concepts. Phenomenal concepts kind of weren't around before Jackson. So you might think of Jackson as a very good argument for supposing that we have some ways of thinking about conscious mental states that aren't third personal, aren't scientific, a kind of, you think about them from the inside in terms of what they're like. Jackson forced physicalists to start introducing these phenomenal concepts. Okay, so that's why Jackson's argument looked like a good argument. Until you had phenomenal concepts, you didn't have a way of responding. Okay, now we got phenomenal concepts. Uh, then you got a battery of arguments pushed by Jackson and especially by Dave Chalmers that said, well, generally it can be the case that you have two different concepts refer to the same thing, and it mightn't be immediately apparent that they refer to the same thing. Uh, but they said that's not a possibility for phenomenal concepts. Their thought was, look, phenomenal concepts are special. If you think about it, phenomenal concepts, I mean, I'm really simplifying now, but this is the gist of the line of argument. Phenomenal concepts give you direct insight into the nature of your experiences. You're thinking about them, as I said, from the inside. You're thinking about them in terms of what they're like. And the thought is that that kind of thinking, phenomenal thinking, reveals the nature of the states they refer to. Phenomenal concepts reveal the nature of the mental states they refer to. And then the argument goes, well, if those states were physical, then surely your phenomenal thinking about them, you think about them in terms of what they're like, you introspect those states, would show you that they're physical. But phenomenal thinking doesn't show you that they're physical, so they can't be physical. Okay, so I told you all that to explain where phenomenal concepts come in and explain what the anti-physicalists say about phenomenal concepts. Anti-physicalists agree that there are phenomenal concepts, but they say that they're revelatory. They reveal the nature of their reference. And then they point out that they don't reveal that they're physical, so the reference can't be physical. Okay, so a physicalist like me agrees they're phenomenal concepts, but I'm going to deny that they're revelatory. I think what they refer to, the experience of seeing something red, is in fact a physical state. It's oscillation in V4, but that it's that kind of physical state certainly isn't revealed by thinking about it in the direct first personal point of view. So I think it's perfectly coherent to suppose that a zombie exists, a zombie version of me, uh, because we have these phenomenal concepts and it's not a priori obvious what they refer to. So if you say, look, here's a being that's physically like me, it's got a certain oscillation in V4, and then you say, using your phenomenal concept, but it doesn't feel like this for it, because you've got these two concepts, oscillation in V4 and feeling like that, and you can say, because it's not contradictory, it's just like saying it's conceivable that Archie Leach was born in Bristol and Cary Grant wasn't, because it's not a priori, it's not obvious Archie Leach and Cary Grant are the same person. So it's conceivable that their being who's got an oscillation in V4, but isn't having any red experience, because it's not obvious a priori that what this feeling, that concept refers to, is the same as oscillation in V4. But in truth, it does refer to the oscillation in V4. So the possibility that you're conceiving of here, that there's a being like me, oscillation in V4, but doesn't have any red color experience, is not a real possibility. It's just like Archie Leach was born in Bristol and Cary Grant wasn't. That's conceivable. Many people might actually believe it, but it's not possible. It's not possible, since Archie Leach and Cary Grant are the same person, for one to be born in Bristol and the other one not. So that's why I think yes, Uh, uh, Zombies are conceivable, but not possible. And as soon as you think they are phenomenal concepts and you respond to the Jackson argument like that, that's what you have to say.
Okay. Um, oh, there's another thing that people will say too. People are kind of concerned about mental states being sort of essentially private, I guess. And the idea again is just going to be like, I can sort of scan your brain or whatever, but I'd never be able to sort of figure out, what it is that you're feeling, even if I had sort of perfect information, right? So there's this kind of thought that like, well, it's sort of essentially private, right? Are you gonna sort of deny that then? Like, no, if we knew, what was going on, if we had perfect information, we actually just would know what it was like or what you were feeling or whatever.
Uh, so if you let's just stick with the example we've got.
Hmm.
So there's a certain kind of experience you have when you look at red roses and ripe tomatoes, and let's call that the experience of seeing something red. Let's call it red experience. I mean, it's not actually red because the experience isn't red, but it's instead of saying the experience of seeing something red all the time, let's just say red experience, right? Uh, and I'm supposing that's oscillation phi in V4. Okay, well, if you know that red experiences oscillation phi in V4, no problem. You uh, have enough electrodes, you can see this oscillation phi in V4. You know I'm having a red experience. No difficulty there. Uh, uh, of course, I mean, many people make what I think of as a rather vulgar mistake. They say, "Oh, I can see that you've got oscillation phi in V4, but just in virtue of seeing that on the, the EEG device or whatever, doesn't doesn't deliver what it's like for me. So I fully aware of uh, what's going on in your brain, but I'm not there with given what it's like. And what they're thinking is the fact that they're looking at my brain doesn't make them see red. And but of course, there's no reason why it should. I mean, it's one experience to look at my brain. It's another experience to look at a ripe tomato, and there's no reason why the first experience should generate the second experience. What the physicist has to say is that you can get to know that I'm seeing red by looking at my brain, but the physicist doesn't have to say that you're going to end up seeing red yourself by looking at my brain. That doesn't isn't required at all. So yeah,
Right.
I,
Um,
I think once one brings in phenomenal concepts, there's no big difficulty about the fact that, I mean, if you don't know that that oscillation in V4 is red experience, well, then you could look at my brain and not know uh, what experience I'm having. But once you know the correlation, know the equation between V4 oscillation and red experience, then you can infer what I'm feeling from looking at my brain, as many neuroscientists do often enough.
yeah. So all of this, I think, has sort of been, I guess, well within the sort of orthodoxy of thinking about, fill of mind stuff. There's a couple of things that I was curious about that, uh, I mean, they're certainly like relevant, right? People think about these, but maybe it's different people thinking about it. I'm not entirely sure, but one of them is sort of like, AI consciousness, right? Do you think there's some sort of in principle difficulty with it, or you think no, it's in principle like fine, and we just have to sort of see what happens.
Yeah, as a materialist, obviously, I mean, I don't feel there's any in principle reason why AI systems shouldn't be conscious, but that raises a whole lot of difficult issues. And perhaps we should move on to that because so far we've been talking as if the physicalist is perfectly happy with the idea of some states being conscious, people are conscious, stones aren't conscious, so on. And all they're adding is that, look, you didn't realize it, but these different kinds of conscious states are just different kinds of brain processes. But there's a lot of everyday thoughts about consciousness, which I think get undermined once you become a physicalist. And I mean, that's because I think a lot of everyday thoughts about consciousness are implicitly premised on dualism. People think about the mind-brain relation in a dualist way. I think it's very natural for human beings to be dualists. We're kind of native-born dualists, and I've said this ever since I started writing about consciousness. So it's kind of not like physicalism is going to leave everything the same. Uh, and some physicalists kind of being aware of that and thinking, look, the truth about consciousness is going to be very different from what most people assume, say that they're illusionists. They want to say consciousness is an illusion. And in fact, I don't really disagree with the illusionists on much that's substantial. I don't disagree with them about what they think is actually going on. But I'm not especially inclined to be an illusionist myself, just because it seems so stupid to go around saying nothing is conscious, nobody's conscious, people aren't conscious. Come on, it's obvious that people are conscious, and and when you have a general anesthetic, you stop being conscious, and so on. So, but but still, there's some truth in this illusionist thought. So let me just give you the most obvious instance of this. If you're a physicalist, you will think, it seems to me pretty unavoidable, that there will be borderline cases of consciousness. So, look, we haven't really talked about theories of consciousness. I mean, we talked about uh, uh, the experience of seeing something red as being a certain kind of oscillation in V4. That's okay. But now, a lot of people want to know. Let's move away from, as it were, the determinate the experience as of seeing something red to the determinable being conscious. Let's put all the states that are conscious in uh, a box and let's ask what's the physical characteristic that's common to all those conscious states. Let's come up with a physical theory of consciousness as such, not the consciousness involved in seeing something red, but just being conscious as opposed to not being conscious. And of course, there's plenty of physical theories of this kind. There's global workspace theory, integrated information theory, recurrent loop theory, uh, higher order theories, and so on. So different physicalist theories of what's common to all the conscious states. And one thing that's pretty obvious if you go along with theories like that is that there's going to be borderline cases. So let's take global workspace theory, that there's some uh, central nervous system, some part of the central nervous system that that takes information from different sensory channels and integrates it and processes a bit and then distributes it to uh, uh, different action channels. And now you might think, well, okay, but clearly humans have such a global workspace, and arguably uh, uh, primates do, and maybe birds, but birds have pretty different brains. They don't have a cortex, but maybe they have something similar. But what about octopuses? Uh, what about fish? Uh, and okay, there'll be some organisms that clearly don't have a global workspace, worms, and some that clearly do, mammals and birds. And then in between, there's going to be some borderline cases, right? So, given everything I said, I'm a physicalist. I endorse this global workspace theory of consciousness. There are going to be some borderline cases of organisms or borderline cases of states of some organisms where it's indeterminate whether they're conscious. And many people think, but that makes no sense. How can it be indeterminate whether an organism is conscious or not? I mean, either, think about it inside. I mean, either there's some light there or it's all dark. And maybe it's a very dim light, but a dim light is still a light and it's different from everything being dark. Uh, so, so if you're a physicalist, you're going to have to override this very natural seeming intuition and say, yeah, there are going to be some borderline cases of consciousness. There are going to be some organisms, so some states of organisms where it's not true that it's conscious and it's not true that it's not conscious. Now, so I get to worry about we got these AI systems, and your question suggested, well, take any given AI system, either it's conscious or it's not conscious. I'm not so sure. I think there's going to be plenty of indeterminacy here. There's no definite fact to the matter. Uh, I've got a paper I'm working on. Well, it's kind of more or less finished, but the volume is taking a long time to get published, where I am concerned about the ethical dimension of this, which which organisms and which artificial systems uh, are deserving of our moral concern. Which organisms and artificial systems should we start worrying about their welfare? What does it take to be a moral patient? Where a moral patient means something deserving of moral concern. And I want to say, look, most people think that the answer to that question is, well, they're deserving of moral concern if and only if they're conscious. And I don't like that answer because I'm not sure there's going to be a good answer about whether crabs, say, are conscious, or indeed whether some artificial systems. I think quite soon we're going to have, especially systems designed to be social companions, where people are going to come seriously concerned about should we be worrying about people treating them badly? Should we be worrying about them suffering? And they're going to say, well, it depends on whether they're conscious. And I don't think there's going to be an answer to whether they're conscious, but I think there needs to be an answer about whether we should care about their suffering. So I think the moral questions are more definite than the questions about consciousness, because consciousness is a lot less of a definite business than we naturally inclined to suppose. So, sorry, you asked me, do I think AI systems are conscious? And my thought was that there's nothing stopping them because I'm a materialist, and so I mean, it's not like they're missing some magic soul thing or something that's stopping them conscious. But having said there's no principal thing to rule it out. I don't think there's going to be any easy answers to which ones are conscious and which ones aren't. And moreover, I think we ought to bypass that question in thinking about how we ought to treat them and worry about their welfare.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I guess I sort of wonder about. One very, very briefly, hopefully, is the illusionist thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, um, they don't really like. I mean, they deny consciousness in like one sense, I guess. Like if you think that consciousness is like this extra stuff, then like they deny that, right?
Yeah.
But illusionists don't actually deny like, I have an experience, you have an experience, right? We all sort of have experiences. The illusion part of illusionism is like, this sort of really strong sort of feeling that there's got to be this extra stuff. And like once we sort of figure out, what that is, that's the illusion for illusionists, right?
Okay.
Like,
So in that sense, I'm an illusionist. Of course, I'm an illusionist in that sense. But yeah, okay.
right. So there's a second thing I guess I sort of wonder about. When you're thinking about these indeterminacy cases, do you think it's sort of like an epistemic thing? Like there's a fact about whether, lobsters are conscious, we just can't know? Or is it like, sort of like the sand paradox, where it's like, you have a pile of sand and you take away a grain and there's no sort of like right answer about what, when it becomes not a pile of sand. Is it like a sort of like epistemic problem, or you think like, no, there just really is no answer?
It's a second. I don't think it's epistemic. I think it's whatever you want to say, ontological. Uh, though, right. I mean, uh, I don't think there's indeterminacy in reality. I think reality is as it is. I mean, I think how it is for uh, the artificial social companion, or how it is for the crabs. That's not indeterminate. What's indeterminate is whether our concept conscious applies to them or not. So the reality is definite enough, but our concepts are vague. That's what I
Right.
think. But I don't think it's an epistemic thing. Like our concepts draw a sharp line, and we just can't tell where it is. I just don't think there is a sharp line. I actually think it's a bit worse than the the heap of sand in that it's just kind of not obvious which things are relevant to organisms being conscious. I mean, at least, it's obvious what is relevant to this being a heap, right? How many grains you've got. But uh, consciousness is worse than that, I think. When we think about all the different kinds of organisms, the insects, the crustaceans, the octopuses, which are, fancy snails, they're mollusks. And do they have the right stuff to be conscious? It's not like do they have enough grains of sand? It's, I mean, is the strange system of lobes in the arms of the octopus something that contributes to consciousness or not? It's I think we're really struggling here. Uh,
Yeah, that's
let, let
interesting.
let me say something. It's kind of to do with phenomenal concepts. So Ned Block's got this famous paper on a confusion about the function of consciousness. Is that what it's called? Where he distinguished between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. And he's very keen. Access consciousness is kind of self-consciousness. It's which states are introspectively available, which states play a role in uh, reasoning and action control. That's all kind of functional stuff. And he says, well, no, you can talk about that kind of stuff, and you can draw some lines, and you could say there's a kind of consciousness, self-awareness if you are an organism is able to think about or manipulate certain of its states. But that's not the real thing, he says. The real thing is what its likeness. And he wants to say there's phenomenal consciousness, and let's not assume that phenomenal consciousness is the same as access consciousness. So, I mean, it's kind of arguing against uh, higher order theories of consciousness, where, say, consciousness is just when you have states that are about other mental states. I mean, he's not trying to rule out by his argument that higher order theories might be right, though he does think they're wrong. He just wants to make the point that the issue of consciousness is to do with what its likeness, and it can't be taken for granted that that's going to coincide with any kind of functional characterization. And then he addresses the issue. Okay, what is phenomenal consciousness? Come on, give us a bit more of a story about that. And he says, I'm afraid I can't define it in any remotely non-circular way. All we can do is uh, attend to our own conscious states and uh, and form the idea that of things that are like this. And I mean, that's what his notion of phenomenal consciousness is. It's just whatever's going on in these paradigm cases of our conscious states. And if you think about it, that's just terribly vague. I mean, we know that we have a pile of conscious states, all our visual experiences, all our pains, all the things that are going on when we're awake. In fact, quite a lot of things that are going on when we're dreaming, things that not things that are going on when we have a general anesthetic. And so it's things like this, okay? But if you look at the activities in the mushroom bodies that play the role of a cortex in insects, and ask yourself, is what's going on there like what's going on in me when I have a red experience? I mean, we've got nothing to go on. Like in what respects? Just pointing to our own conscious states and saying states like this is not giving us a very definite hold on what consciousness is. But that's the official line taken by most contemporary philosophers, that what we're interested in is phenomenal consciousness, and phenomenal consciousness can't be defined. It's just a matter of pointing to our conscious states. And I think that leaves us in a very kind of undefined situation.
I mean, do you think there's anything else to be said about it, or you think there really just kind of isn't much to be said? You just sort of think it's unfortunate.
I think it's all a mess. I mean, I'm in fact very skeptical about the whole consciousness business, I'm afraid. I mean, many scientists are committed to developing theories of consciousness, and it's a big business. They have conferences, they have debates. But I mean, recent one had a big symposium uh, involving the IIT, Integrated Information Theory people, and uh, recurrent loops people, and higher order thought people, and they kind of recognize that there's absolutely no way of uh, deciding between these different theories, uh, and they draw the lines in very different places. I mean, integrated information theory makes any kind of system where the whole is greater than the parts in sense conscious, uh, which will make some pretty simple artificial devices conscious, whereas higher order theories of consciousness make pretty much only humans conscious, and there's all the scientific work, but it's not quite clear that anything is going to help people make progress here. I mean, look, there are serious people who work quite hard on this. I mean, my colleagues in London, Nick Shea and Jonathan Birch, both disagree with me quite strongly. They think that uh, there are a lot of common features. I mean, get away from Ned Block's just pointing to states like this. There are a lot of common features are distinctive about human conscious states, and you can expect there to be some kind of uh, uh, explanation of why all those common features hang together. And once we figured out that, why the common features hang together, then we'll be able to apply that to other organisms. So they think it's not as indeterminate as I do, but yeah, I don't think there is much else except access consciousness. And the idea that there's some further category of phenomenal consciousness beyond that, I have my doubts about. I'm afraid I think a lot of the science is driven by unthinking implicit dualism. I don't, I mean, I'm not going to, the philosophically sophisticated scientists and the philosophers who work on this are, uh, I mean, unless they are actually dualists, I mean, the materialists are aware of this and they're trying to find a way that gets beyond uh, just the dualist intuitions. But I'm not sure that they can get very far beyond that.
Right. Um,
Interesting. Let me just make one point.
yeah.
All these problems are just as much problems for panpsychists as for physicalists, because the panpsychists think that in our world, the quiddities that breathe fire into the equations are kind of all the kind of substances of reality that grounds consciousness. But they think that the substance that grounds consciousness is everywhere. It's in stones, it's in trees, and so on. But they don't want to say that uh, these simple elements that by their nature can ground consciousness are good enough to make the stones conscious. It's only sometimes when you put these parts together that you get whole subjects that are conscious. And so they've got to try and draw the line too between the wholes that are conscious and the wholes that really aren't conscious. And they have all the same problems I've just been talking about.
Um, there was, you mentioned very briefly, it was just sort of like a throwaway thing, I think, but um, you mentioned that, like on a sort of higher order picture, right? It's about, I don't know, I guess like mental states sort of being about other mental states, right? So the idea there is, like what I have like a mental state about thinking about my experience of seeing red or something. It's like sort of aware of the first order sort of thing, or what's the idea?
Uh, I'm no great expert on higher order theories of consciousness, but the rough idea is to equate consciousness with self-consciousness. So there's the state that consists of neural oscillation in V4, that's seeing something red, but for the higher order theorists, that's not the kind of thing that can be conscious per se. It gets to be conscious if you have the thought about that state that I'm having the experience of something red. Okay, that's a higher order thought theory of consciousness. There are also higher order theories that have something like an inner sensing, introspection of your activity in V4, which isn't a thought about it, but a kind of some inner perception like focus on that state. But there has to be another mental state that's about the first order mental state. So those are two variants of higher order theories of consciousness. Then there's another dimension. Many higher order theories of consciousness want to say it's not that you're actually having a, a mental state about the mental state that makes the latter mental state consciousness, but you could. They're dispositional higher order theories. They say a state is conscious if it's possible to be aware of it. Uh, you don't actually have to be aware of it in order for it to be conscious. And in fact, I think my own view is that if you're going to be a higher order theorist, it's better to be a dispositional higher order theorist. But I'm not particularly attracted by higher order theories of consciousness. I mean, there looks to be something wrong about them. I mean, if you, well, perhaps I shouldn't be too quick, but if you're unhappy about the first order states being conscious, why does it help to bring in more mental states that aren't themselves conscious? And then there's, all kind. I mean, so is the higher order state that makes the first order state conscious, is that itself conscious? Uh, that's one kind of worry. Suppose the higher order state gets the first order state wrong, right? You're having an experience in V4, which is kind of the experience as of seeing something red, but you have the higher order thought that I'm having an experience of seeing something green. Uh, does that make the first experience conscious? And if so, does it make it green conscious or red conscious? I mean, higher order theories have a lot of issues. And look, it seems, I mean, the other big worry is it seems to set the bar too high. I mean, you're going to end up with most non-human animals and infants not being conscious. Doesn't seem a very attractive consequence.
Yeah, that's what I was sort of worried about. Because it seems like, I guess most non-human animals are going to be sort of non-conscious on that view, and I don't know, that doesn't seem right. I guess I don't know what sort of argument to give, but I mean, I don't know if I see like a dog or a cat or whatever. I mean, certainly it seems to me like they're conscious. Certainly, I mean, they'd like react to things. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't want to exclude them from my picture.
So, yes, maybe. I mean, one issue here is why is it so natural for us to think in dualist terms? I mean, I think that most people, including myself, when I'm not concentrating, I can't help but thinking that the conscious thing is something extra to the brain activity. Uh, it's difficult to think that there could be cases that are indeterminate in respect to whether they're conscious or not. If we could get rid of all those bad thoughts, if we could get rid of all the illusory thoughts, allow that there can be borderline cases, then I think we might be able to think about consciousness rather better. I mean, Peter Godfrey Smith's recent books, starting with the Octopus book, Other Minds, and then he's written two more, kind of suggests that once we get rid of the bad dualist thinking, then we'll be able to make progress and think of consciousness as something that emerges gradually. Once we have systems, organisms that have a perspective, have a point of view on reality. They have a body. They're aware of their body as being separate from the rest of reality. I mean, that's something that kind of comes along with the fact that organisms can act. If they can act, they have to be able to tell the difference between them bumping into something and something bumping into them. Uh, and so that gives you kind of a perspective of yourself as different from reality. And once you have sense organs and you have some kind of centralization of the information action control, then you have a being that has a point of view and has goals. And I think once you've got that, then you've got the start of consciousness. I mean, I'm happy to be quite uh, eclectic about what's conscious and what's not. I don't want to set the bar too high, but that will be a matter of consciousness coming in degrees. I don't think there's any kind of sharp point where the light comes on. I think that's the wrong way to think. And maybe if we could free ourselves of the dualist thinking, stop having a big problem about consciousness. We could just think about different organisms, different systems that have their different perspectives on reality, have different kinds of mental lives. Yeah, I think fretting about consciousness is a red herring. But as I said, I don't want to go delusionist and go around saying there is no consciousness. But of course, there is no dualist extra stuff. Uh, they're right about that. And it's interesting to think about how we should end up thinking once we really get rid of the idea there's some dualist extra stuff. And I don't think we've got rid of it yet.